My name is Karen Kasner, and I am a board member of the Jewish Council of Public Affairs. It is wonderful to be with all of you today. This seminar, entitled Israel's Election Insights, is the third webinar in a JCPA's Israel Election Series and is co-sponsored by the Israel Policy Forum and the Interagency Task Force on Israeli-Arab Issues. On Tuesday, March 23rd, Israelis went to the polls for the fourth time in 2 years in a hotly contested election with unexpected results. On today's call, we will hear from diverse experts on what this means for Israel's political priorities and what coalition government is likely to emerge. Before we begin, I would like to say a few words about JCPA, which is the National Network Hub of the Jewish Community Relations Councils, representing 125 local JCRCs and 16 national organizations. We come together to grapple with pressing issues of the day, build consensus, advocate with other racial, ethnic, faith, and civic leaders to build a just and pluralistic America and support efforts for Israel's peace and security. I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today's webinar, Michael Koplow, who is Israel Policy Forum's political director. Michael writes Israel Policy Forum's weekly Koplow column and edits the Israel Policy Exchange, which is a leading source for commentary and analysis on Israel and American Jewry. Michael?
Great. Thanks so much, Karen, and thanks to everybody for joining today. So I'm delighted to be joined by two great panelists today. My colleague Shira Efron, who is a policy advisor alongside me at Israel Policy Forum. She was also a special advisor to the RAND Corporation and is currently a fellow at the Institute for National at INSS in Tel Aviv. Alongside her is Thabet Aburas, who is the co-executive director of the Abraham Initiatives. Obviously today's topic is a timely one. It is about the most recent Israeli election, a subject with which I'm sure many people now feel that they are expert, given that there have been 4 in 2 years, and we're possibly headed to a 5th. So before I get to Shira and Thabet, we all have a chance to hear their insights, I'm going to give just a quick background overview of what happened on March 23rd during this 4th election. So as we have seen with the previous 3, there is something of a deadlock between what people refer to as the 2 blocks in Israel. There is one block of parties that is led by Prime Minister Netanyahu and Likud and is committed to Prime Minister Netanyahu remaining as Prime Minister. These parties are the Prime Minister's own Likud party, the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas, which represents Mizrahi Haredim, Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox Jews, and UTJ, Yahadut HaTorah in Hebrew, which is the Haredi Ashkenazi party, and UTJ is itself split between Hasidic and non-Hasidic factions. And then we also have a new party that Hatzionut Hadatit, religious Zionism, which is comprised of 3 parties. One is led by Bezalel Smotrich, who may be familiar to people. He's been around for some time. One is Otzma Yehudit, the Kahanist Jewish Power Party, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir. And the third is Noam, which is effectively an anti-LGBT party. And those 4 parties together constitute the pro-Netanyahu bloc. And in this election, Likud received 30 seats, Shas received 9, UTJ received 7, and religious Zionism received 6. And so, as you can see from those numbers, they are short of the 61 seats that they would need to form a coalition outright. On the other side, you have a bloc of parties that is opposed to Netanyahu. They have dubbed themselves the Bloc for Change. That bloc is led by Yesh Atid and Yair Lapid, who received 17 seats in this election. Coming in next in that block is Kahol Lavan, blue and white, led by Benny Gantz, who was effectively the leader of the anti-Netanyahu group of parties in elections 1, 2, and 3. He lost that mantle after the third election when he agreed to bring his Kahol Lavan party into a unity government with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that's when we saw the deal struck between them for an alternating prime minister position, and where you had the government split equally between Likud and Kahol Lavan, and that is currently the situation at the moment, and that is going to continue through a transitional government until a new government is formed. This time, Benny Gantz got 8 seats, which is well down from Kahol Lavan's high of, I think, 35. Next, you have Labor under Merav Michaeli, which received 7 seats. You have Yisrael Beitenu under Avigdor Lieberman, the secular party that traditionally represents Russian Olim. So he's also at 7 seats. You have the joint list under Ayman Odeh at 6 seats. You have Tikva Hadasha, led by Gideon Sa'ar, which was effectively a breakaway from Likud, of Likud MKs who also want to see Prime Minister Netanyahu replaced. Tikva Hadasha, New Hope, received 6 seats. And then you have Meretz, the traditional secular left-wing party, which also receives 6 seats. There are 2 parties that I have not mentioned, parties number 12 and 13. One of them is Yamina, which is the right-wing party, the traditional settler base, led by Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett, before the election, refused to commit to either being part of the Netanyahu camp or being part of the anti-Netanyahu camp. He did set some conditions on whether he would join one or the other, but he refused to commit in any way definitively. And then you have Ra'am, led by Mansour Abbas, the United Arab List in English. Ra'am received 4 seats, and Ra'am is one of the 4 parties that has comprised the joint list. Ra'am broke away from the joint list before this election to run independently, and Ra'am as well has not committed to being in either the pro-Netanyahu bloc or the anti-Netanyahu bloc. I'm sure we're going to talk about Ra'am much more during this conversation, but Ra'am has set forth a list of 6 conditions that they would like met before they join any government. So those are the 13 parties that comprise the 24th Knesset, and there is no clear path for anybody to form a government. Neither the pro-Netanyahu bloc or the anti-Netanyahu bloc are at the magic number of 61. And so what that means is that both sides have been spending much of their time courting the 2 undecided parties, Yamina with their 7 seats and Ra'am with their 4 seats. And even in the midst of courting those parties, there are difficulties because there are conditions that different parties in each of these blocks have placed upon, the different parties have placed upon the coalition process and who they will and will not sit with. So that is a basic overview of where we are. And the timeline now is that on Sunday and Monday, the parties in the Knesset are going to send their party heads to President Ruvi Rivlin, where they will make their recommendations for who should get the first chance to form a government. On Wednesday, so 6 days from today, President Rivlin is going to make an announcement about who is going to get the first shot at forming a government. That person will have 28 days to try and put a coalition together with a potential 14-day extension. If whoever President Rivlin appoints is not able to, then President Rivlin can turn to the next candidate, who will then also have 28 days plus an additional 14 if requested to try to form a government. And if neither of those works, then the Knesset itself can send a recommendation to President Rivlin Critically, though, if that happens, that recommendation has to come along with 61 seats from the Knesset, whereas now President Rivlin can choose really anybody he likes based on who he thinks has the best shot. And if none of these work, then Israelis will be going to election number 5, something with which they have become very familiar. So with that as an overview, I'll again thank Shira and Thabet for joining us. And Shira, I'm gonna start with you for the first question. You know, as I said, we now have this 4th election. It ended in a similar deadlock to what we saw following the first 3 elections. And so, you know, given this deadlock, how do you rate the chances of someone being able to form a government? And what do you see as the clearest potential path for a government to be formed?
Thank you, Michael, and good evening, everyone from Israel. And happy holiday. I know also Easter is coming. You know, Michael, you described the situation, and it's just crazy. The 13 parties that crossed the threshold, and they're going to make recommendations, and neither bloc, as they're called, right, the pro-Netanyahu bloc or the one that's fine with Netanyahu, and the change bloc don't have the 61. I don't like making predictions, and I really think we're seeing very unnatural alliances between political parties. So anything can happen. Anything can happen. But the scenario that you just described makes me believe, and many analysts believe, that the most likely outcome is a 5th election. Just because you can square the circle somehow. Now, the party that you, so this could be the situation, and it's not terrible for Netanyahu, right? For he will remain prime minister. There's some wrinkles with Benny Gantz, the head of Blue White. We can talk about it, but this could happen. I would say that the second most likely could be that Netanyahu is tasked with forming a government because he has higher likelihood, and we can talk about the numbers in a moment, and then that he's able to form what you would call a minority government with support from the outside. So the head of Ram, Mansour Abbas, just I just saw something in the newspaper about a couple of hours ago that he said that he was going to support neither bloc. But still, if Naftali Bennett, which is you also mentioned, Naftali Bennett received 5% of the Israeli vote, so it's so crazy, right? 5% of the Israeli vote. But if he decides to go with Netanyahu, pose demands and go with Netanyahu, then Netanyahu will have the pro-Netanyahu bloc will be at 59. This will be more a higher number than the Yair Lapid bloc, if you say, and that they'll have 57. Rivlin can assign Netanyahu with forming the government, and then he can bring it to the vote in the Knesset. And in the Knesset, Ram can vote for the government or even abstain. Then you have a government. It's a minority government. It's a very problematic government. Maybe it's not a government that will be able to govern very well, but we're used to that by now. But this could happen. I'm not saying it's a very likely scenario because you described these parties, the religious Zionism and Noam and Otzma Yehudit and all these. It would be very hard for them to live with the thought of getting the support of an Islamist party that is really a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? Even from the outside. But I'm not saying it cannot happen. There is an option, and Michael, I think you wrote about today in your column, but there is an option that even though Yair Lapid is the head of what you would call the opposition with a relatively large party, he's not going to get the support of anyone to form a government. And if he concedes and lets Naftali Bennett be at the helm of this bloc, you can have, theoretically, maybe as a third option, a government formed by the blockchain, which would be headed by Naftali Bennett. But that's also crazy. You would have Meretz and Labor supporting Naftali Bennett. That is way more to the right than Netanyahu on many issues to be prime minister. So I'm not sure this will happen. I'll say the last scenario because it's something that people have been speculating about for about 2 years. And and sort of got off the headlines, but today Haaretz editorial spoke about it again. There is an option that would be a way out of this. It's not good for Israeli democracy. It's pulling Putin or Erdogan or whatever you want to call it. But if Netanyahu becomes the president of Israel, because if Netanyahu becomes the president of Israel, then Likud is, kosher again, and then you can have a very right-wing party with Likud, right? No one said they're not going to sit with Likud. The idea is not sitting with Netanyahu. So it would be very bad for the Israeli left, maybe, or the central left, but it would be very good for the right-wing parties, and it's a way out. The reason why it's so timely is that Ruvi Rivlin, the current president, is ending his terms in June, I think. Is it June or July? And there are 30, usually it's customary, there are no elections for the president, the Knesset votes, it takes place, the elections are 30 days before the end of the term. Netanyahu, either way, will want to have a say in who's the next president because they can pardon him. There is some interpretation if Netanyahu becomes the president, his trial is canceled. So this could be another crazy scenario that is back sort of in the game. But it's hard for me to place bets on, which one of those is more likely.
Yeah, and just to highlight something or pick up something that you just said, there have been different backdrops to each of these 4 elections, but in the next few months, we do have President Rivlin's term ending and a new election for president. Netanyahu's trial, the evidentiary phase of his trial is starting, I think, this week. Monday, next week rather. And so we do have this churn, and all of this is gonna impact, I think, and of course Netanyahu's ongoing quest for immunity or for the trials to be canceled. So this is all going to impact things. Thabet, I want to turn to you. We've mentioned Ra'am now a few times, and I think the story that has gotten the most attention, both in Israel but probably also here in the United States, is Ra'am breaking away from the joint list and getting 4 Knesset seats on its own, and Mansour Abbas's willingness to play coalition politics. But before we get to Abbas and Ra'am specifically, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more generally about the issues that are motivating Arab Israeli voters and to what extent those issues have changed over time.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. Well, first, the results in the 4th round of the election in the last 2 years intensify the split within the Israeli society and make it more personal, either with Bibi or against Bibi. It seems that the tie between the 2 camps will continue as long as Bibi is there. And this situation may lead us to 5th round of election. Because of the balance in power between the 2 camps, the importance of the Arab voters is very obvious. The major parties count the Arab votes and count in the Arab voters. We are in the same boat. Our interests have been affected following 4 rounds of election. People got tired and the turnout went down, especially in the Arab community. The turnout among Arabs low as 45%, less than 45%. This is the lowest since the inception of the State of Israel. Yet, with this come actually the legitimization to Arab voters. Actually, it's unprecedented. It's never like this. Legitimacy in Israel is irreversible, I believe, and we cannot really ignore that. Nobody can ignore that in the future. This is one of the positive things during this election. And I believe that the time is ripe for political partnership between Jewish parties and Arab parties. And no doubt that Arabs are moving from crying politics to politics of engagement and the politics of influence. Now, I believe that the large interests of the Arab citizen are overlapping with the interests of the general public. Issues like equality, democracy, peace, and justice are values that people in Israel share. However, the Arab community has different challenges. I will say that Arab members of the Knesset really stressing nowadays issues like combating violence and crime, planning and housing issues. And just to mention just a few minutes ago, the leader of the Islamic movement, a member of Knesset, Mansour Abbas, just deliver a speech in prime time in 3 different Israeli channels. Okay, this is unprecedented, never happened before. This shows that really the civic discourse and the issues related to our community, internal issues, such as he mentioned, for example, the crime and violence and the housing issues. And he didn't nominate anybody. He just kind of gambling. He said, well, I'm open to issues, but his speech, his discourse is very interesting. Talking about shared future, talking about common grounds. It's a very civic and civic discourse. I believe that this trend will actually, it's this trend in politics, it's both Arab parties, the joint list and the united list, which is, this is the official name of the Islamic movement, will continue with this track. And very interesting, for the first time since the 1967 war, since 1967 occupation, the Arab parties didn't mention occupation, didn't mention the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and actually it's very interesting. So I mentioned the unprecedented turnout, low turnout, but also the significance of Ra'am. It's very important in this election. It's emerged to be the leading Arab party. The leading Arab party right now. It's a traditional religious party. And also, I would like to mention here that in this election, we saw something new, the campaigning in Arab community that led by Netanyahu. Netanyahu shuttled actually Arab towns, met with dozens of Arab mayors for the first time, but actually the results are very slim. He got, the Likud got even less than 1 seat in terms of voters, number of votes. So this is the situation right now. I believe the split within Arab community is very interesting. It's over social issues. And the move by Mansour Abbas, the Islamic leader Mansour Abbas, it's not about short term. It's not a political maneuvering. It's new track that we have to pay attention to it, that Arabs are adopting, Arab citizens actually adopting a civic discourse on the expense of the national discourse and the religious discourse.
So I want to follow up a little bit on that. You know, in terms of Ra'am itself. So obviously, you know, they're pursuing a different path than the joint list. Do you see Ra'am's success in this election as a function of its stance on social and religious issues and a sign of right-wing politics within the Arab Israeli community becoming more prominent? Or is it a function of Arab Israelis wanting to have actual influence in the Knesset and in coalition politics in Israeli society? Is it something else entirely? And if Ra'am does end up joining a government or even supporting a minority government from the outside, what do you think the reaction is going to be on the part of Israeli Arabs? Is it going to mean more electoral success for Ra'am going forward, or is it going to be more controversial?
Well, I believe that both parties, both Arab parties, actually has been working for politics of engagement. Actually, I describe that as moving from crying politics to politics of influence. And actually start 2015, even before, with Ayman Audi, the leader of the joint list. And just to remind you, the nomination of the joint list with all 4 different parties just last year when they nominated Gantz to form the government. They are all the time looking for influence. The question if the Jewish parties, the leaders of the Jewish parties, are willing to accept this partnership, politics of partnership, the politics of engagement. And I don't believe, I cannot call it right-wing Arab politics, since the issue of equality, it's the background for all Arabs. They would like to, are knocking in the doors of the Israeli government for a long time for influence. And it's not an issue, it's not controversial, that controversial actually, within the Arab community, since according to so many different surveys and polls that conducted, and my organization, the Abraham Initiative, also conducted, we see that the overwhelming majority of Arabs in favor of politics of engagement. So this is the real issue. There is a competition between two streams, two political parties now. Who's gonna lead? Who's gonna gain? Who's gonna be the most influence? But there is some really debate over within the Arab community if Mansour Abbas has to really support Netanyahu. All in all, I would like to say that until last year, the Arab community demanded and was part of the efforts to remove Netanyahu from power following his hate speeches and the incitement against the Arabs, and all of a sudden to be part of his own government, it's a little bit of a problem. But all the time we are witnessing a bottom-up pressure for politics of influence, and this it's a strategy. It's not a tactic actually, and both parties are adopting this strategy.
Shira, we've seen this decades-long trend in Israeli politics of the right becoming increasingly dominant, really dating back to Menachem Begin's election in 1977 and just growing from there. And in the last 5 years, the Israeli left cratered to the point of almost being shut out of the Knesset. There was real talk and real concerns, I think, on the left that Labor and Meretz were in danger of not even making this Knesset threshold. And one way in which this election was different than the previous three is that we see the beginnings of a comeback for Labor under Merav Michaeli getting up to 7 seats, which, in the context of history is certainly not impressive. In the context of the last 3 elections, is actually more impressive. Do you think this is anything more than a blip in terms of a Labor comeback, or are there really genuine hopes for the Israeli left to become politically relevant again? And if so, what would they have to do to actually follow up on this success?
So I guess there are a few points in this, and I'll get to the core of your question in a moment. But I think it's very, very difficult to speak in Israel about right and left. Okay, let's just talk about the right and left today. Netanyahu, right, the head of Likud. People will say he is right. How is he right wing? Even economic policies, he's no longer the neoliberal. He gave checks to every Israelis, stimulus plans that in the US would never pass. I mean, it's not just going to he was the most, I would say, cautious on the Israeli-Palestinian angle. Not, doing a lot of things, basically paying protection to Hamas, so not to have a war in Gaza. Settlers complain that he didn't let them build in settlements as much as he wants. So I mean, it's very, very difficult to talk about in left and right. What you say is correct in the sense that the left shrunk, but the left has become, it's like a swear word in Hebrew. There's also a way to transcribe it now in Hebrew with a typo. It's really offensive. And people will say, I'm not left. I'll give you just an anecdote. My cousin, she's half American, she would always say like, oh, I'm not left. But she voted for Merav Michaeli, So I mean, you say you're not left, but you're voting for now clearly a left-wing party. So I think people are really afraid of being tagged as left. And if you look historically, perspective on Labor was not left. It was center left. When Yitzhak Rabin was the head of labor and he became the head of labor and people were more of the Paris camp, they feared that the party is going more to the right on some things. In a sense, if you look not this election, but I mean this election also, but even the previous elections, blue-white was in a sense a continuation of the historical labor. Even Yair Lapid, he has similar views, right? So what you have today, Merav Michaeli, the head of labor, and Meretz, they're sort of like the Meretz of the 90s. They're Shulamit Aloni of once. They're real left. But the center left, I'm not sure it shrunk so much. It's just a use of terminology. And I think it's also important to mention, and there are studies about it that were done, that even if you see more and more votes for parties that are clearly on the right, the Israeli public is not where the right is. Not on issues of separation of state and religion, not on other issues, LGBTQ, and this is very extreme, this party. And by the way, they're not just LGBTQ, they're also now proposed to ban a government decision that would give equality to women in decision-making processes. So it's beyond LGBT, this norm party. And also in terms of separation from the Palestinians, which we haven't spoken about, but it really depends on how you frame it. But most Israelis do not want to annex territory. They don't want to live everyone together, Israelis and Palestinians. They don't want to have control that is more pronounced than what Israel has now. So I think there's really a paradox in the Israeli political system and in how people vote, and kind of a disconnect between how people think about right and left and what they vote for. We do see polls that some people believe that the right-wing parties will be tougher and then therefore will protect Israel better against threats. But that depends on your threat perception and what you're scared of. Final point about Merav Michaeli, I think her achievement is incredible, right? She really took a party that we thought would be dead, completely was dead, literally, and she grew the party, and she could make it relevant again. Time will tell. She was also out of 13 parties, the only one to be led by a woman, to care about this issue. And because of these opposing forces that really try to undermine not only the non-Jewish parts of the population, but also the over 50% of the Jewish population, it's important you have these voices in the government and they're stronger.
Thabet, we've spoken about Ram, of course. Aside from them, who do you see as other pivotal players right now among the smaller parties? And was there anything in the overall election results that you found particularly surprising or that you didn't expect?
Well, yes, there are several actually surprises. First of all, Netanyahu's campaign in the Arab community, it's a very interesting campaign. Prime Minister of Israel leaving everything, shuttling and visiting so many different Arab towns, meeting dozens of Arab mayors and promising things. You have to see the billboards with his photo and his nickname Abu Yair in Arabic, speaking in Arabic even. By the way, actually today his regimes got to already 12 years. He never visited an Arab town before in the last 12 years, major towns, I would say, okay? All of a sudden, he's visited 7 times the Arab towns just in the last 3 months. This is one surprising. The second surprise, the lowest, I would say, turnout. We never had this low figure of 45% only. In the same time, when the Arab themselves, Arab citizens really demand integration and demand politics of influence and so forth, and we are there, and still out of disappointment and frustration of anger for other reasons, okay? Actually, their anger goes to the Arab parties because they split. This slaughter is another surprise. I would say that third surprise, it can be traced to third surprise can be, well, I will leave it for now, for this two surprises. But still, something new in the Israeli politics, the fact that Arab political parties, actually Jewish political parties, return to look for Arab representatives. We have now again an Arab MK in the Labour Party, two Arab MKs in Meretz. This is something new. Okay, so not only have this split in Arab parties, Jewish parties, but we have Arab representatives in Jewish parties, and this is something really that people appreciate this fact that Arabs are now, Jewish parties are open for Arabs. Not to mention that there is Arab representative in the Likud party, another representative in the Israel Beitenu party. So something in you of political partnership, not only among political parties, but also within the parties, Arab-Jewish partnership within the Jewish parties too. I see that this is something new. This trend will increase in the future. In this election, the Jewish parties received almost 20% of the total Arab votes. And this is also something new after a decade of Arab citizens are voting for Arab political parties, mainly for the joint list. In the last election, 88% of the total Arab votes went to the joint list. So these are really things that we have to take in our consideration in the coming future. This trend will continue.
I just want to remind everybody, if you have a question, for our panelists, please put it in the Q&A box. Before we get to audience questions, Shira, I have one more for you. We've now had no permanent government. I suppose we've had one for the last year, but it was obviously not a very stable one. There hasn't been kind of a stable permanent government now for 2 years. How do you see another transitional government impacting the day-to-day governance of Israel, and particularly in terms of its conducting relations with the U.S. and other countries? It's not just the U.S. right now. There's issues with the U.S. over how to approach Iran. Israel, I think, has 10 days left or 9 days left to formally respond to the ICC investigation. There's obviously the continuing management of relations with new normalizing countries under the Abraham Accords. So, how do you see all of this happening under another transitional government? And what's the tangible impact for Israel of this continuing political stagnation? Does it mean that Israeli politics is fundamentally broken, or do you see a way of breaking out of this cycle in the near future?
Yeah, I'll start with the end of your question. I'm not sure if it's fundamentally broken. It's clearly in a huge mess, right? And this hasn't been a new thing, because you have small parties that basically hijack the system. You have mainstream voters that have to pay and bribe, and you get disproportionate, I guess, clout and power. I mentioned this again, but I mean, think about it from a U.S. perspective. A U.S. voter, that a party that would get 5% of the vote of the general population, that we're seriously talking about the head of this party as the potential prime minister, if not a prime minister, for sure a defense minister. Maybe other people in his party is just minister. I mean, this is crazy. So, but then, how do you get out of this mess? People say, oh, you need to raise the threshold, so then you will have less small parties. I'm not sure that's true, because they raised the threshold a few years ago. And what happened is that all this like hacking and the payments started happening before the elections and all the afterwards, right? You would get those mergers. So you have the prime minister engaged in merging parties, so to make sure that they cross the threshold. By the way, that's also the raising the threshold was what made the joint list so big in previous elections, which I don't think it was a negative. But this could be a solution. I'm trying to be really nonpartisan about this, and it's not about the persona himself. But Netanyahu, um, it's like a plug in the system. I think that if he's gone, it would just allow more normal coalition building to resume. And that's part, it's different from a presidential type of government that you have in the US. That's why you don't have term limits. No parliamentary regimes don't have term limits because usually you're not supposed to have this crazy situation. So in a sense, I think if you talk about how we get out of it, if you can find a solution of and getting the persona out and having this non-Netanyahu, pro-Netanyahu, you can resume some sort of growth of new leadership, even within the right, within Likud, but also in others. In terms of how it affects, I think that in terms of the big issues, Iran, ICC, the Palestinians, I'm not sure there's going to be a difference if it's a transitional government than what we've seen now. We need to remember, like the Abraham Accords were signed also in terms of, I mean, we had a government, but it wasn't really an effective government. As long as Netanyahu is heading this transitional government, he's close, his issues are so close to his heart anyway, and he's managing all of them. He's micromanaging them. So I think on the big foreign policy issues, it doesn't matter. But what it matters, not having government, it affects Israeli domestic issues. Maybe it's not much in US terms, but the Israeli deficit now is 170 billion shekels. It's the highest it's been in Israeli history. There hasn't been a budget in over 2 years. So you work with like the budget of 2018 or 2021. Now everyone's talking about it in the news because of COVID. Israelis are not traveling during the Passover holidays. So you used to have 500,000 Israelis that would go away, but now they're here in the country. So Israel all of a sudden realized that they don't have infrastructure. The worst traffic jams they've ever seen ever in Israel, all over it. Education system, police. You haven't had a police chief for 2 years. You had an interim. Now there is a police chief. You need a budget, right? The roads that you will pave in 5 years, you're planning for them now. But if you can't plan for them, you won't have them. The school systems. So I think the stagnation will continue and it will affect Israelis' quality of life at the micro level. And there's a paradox here, right? Because you look at Israel and it's like one of the first countries to emerge from COVID and HMOs function great. And you have this high tech and Iron Dome and other fancy things. But, you know, there's a high tech sector here that's maybe at 50% of the economy that's pulling the rest of the economy. But the rest of the country, it's not that. And not having a government, a functioning government and a budget really affects people's lives here, especially as you emerge from a global pandemic. And I think this should be on everyone's mind.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to questions from the audience now, and we're getting a lot of them in. There are a number of questions about the election and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you know, which we haven't really talked about. You know, so Thabet, if you could talk a little bit about how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has impacted Arab voters and Arab parties, and Shira, you know, if you could talk a little bit about the role that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict played as an issue in the election writ large, and if the outcome of the election is going to have any impact on Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. So Thabet, we'll start with you, please.
Yeah, well, actually, as I mentioned, both Arab political parties didn't mention the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at all. Actually, they concentrated in internal issues. There are real challenges that facing the Arab community right now. And again, I'm mentioning the crime and violence and the other thing, the land and the planning and housing issues. However, we are Palestinians and we are citizen state of Israel. This duality of identity, it's bringing us just don't care about what's going on with Arab brothers and sisters and relatives in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Right now, because the conflict is kind of calm conflict, and even the Palestinians in the occupied territories are concentrating in their own election. Okay, they have actually parliamentary election 2 months from now, and then over the summer they have a presidential election. Hopefully this will happen. We cross fingers that this will happen. I'm not sure it's going to take place. We are really care and we would like to see democracy within our people, the Palestinians, and to see the end of the occupation and establishing Palestinian state alongside Israel. This is still according to, again, surveys that we conducted as Abraham initiatives and other surveys by other institutes. We still see that Arab citizens really care about this issue. It's not in the top challenges and issues that really Arabs really care about them, but still you can find in the third and fourth place in the list of things that really worry Arab citizens. But again, it's one I would say it's one space, and we are relatives. We are so close to each other. We listen to the news from other side of the border, the green line, and we really care. But since we have internal and really important issues, this election, we used to say, well, the Jewish party is not talking about the conflict. Now, even our parties are not talking about the conflict, as this seems that I feel that the right wing of Netanyahu is really succeeding to take the whole discourse from national discourse to internal discourse, civic discourse, and we are following that. This is one of the criticism to a lot of parties in this election, that they didn't really mention that, and without connecting that to the nation state law and other things, really, still we have concern. Even one more important thing I would like to mention, that Mansour Abbas, MK Mansour Abbas, in his speech just last hour, they didn't mention the word Palestine or Palestinian, even how he identifies himself, saying, I am an Arab, I am a Muslim, and I'm an Israeli. Okay, this is a new track in Arab politics, a new trend, and we will see where he goes with that. It's very interesting politics.
Shira?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think the last comment that Thabet had about Mansour Abbas basically hiding his Palestinian identity and going into the separation of different types, it's really remarkable and shows you the importance of this issue in Israel. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has not been shaping how Israelis have been voting for a few years now. I mean, there is a threat perception, right? And you look at polling, it's like, okay, because there are threats and the right will protect us better. But there hasn't been an initiative. The last 2 years have been the quietest from terrorist perspective, attacks on Israel. So there's not, it's not on the agenda for most Israelis. Ironically, if you want the peace to prosperity, remember that the Trump peace plan, it looks like ages ago, but it was something that people spoke about, and then there was an annexation plan. Hard to believe it's been less than a year, right? But we were all scared this would happen, and this was on the agenda, but I'm not sure if there were elections exactly at that time. But also then you saw that in polls, most Israelis were against the annexation itself. If they thought it's within an international support, they're like, why not? But the annexation per se, there was no like big enthusiasm for it or even interest in it among the general public. It's still the right got the same number of parties. So there's really a disconnect. The election's outcome and how will they affect negotiations? Listen, I don't know. It's very, very difficult. Depends what coalition you have. If you have a very right-wing coalition, right? Very, very right-wing coalition, it's probably going to make negotiations even less likely than they are under all other scenarios. Plus, you will have more visible steps toward annexation, indefinite control of the West Bank. I don't want to use the A word, but we know there are parties that are advocating for it publicly, right? They're saying we will annex the territory and give the Palestinians there. They also don't call them Arabs. we'll give, they don't call them Palestinians, they call them Arabs. We'll give the Arabs some rights, and if they're unhappy with it, they can leave. So there are calls. I'm not sure. I think Netanyahu is going to be cautious about it if he's dead, but this is what you're going to have. Naturally, if you had a Yair Lapid coalition with more center-left, you could have a change. But as we said, the scenario is I don't think Yair Lapid is going to head any government, and I don't think that is going for any negotiations with the Palestinians. We haven't spoken about it, but there could be Palestinian elections coming soon, with Hamas having lists with, let's say, problematic candidates from Israel's perspective. So the circumstances are not that Israel will be pressed into making decisions, right? It's not like President Biden, this is a top priority, and the US is going to force Israelis and Palestinians to sit in the room, and the Israeli political constellation is going to say, oh no, we can't do that. So maybe it's luckily for the right in Israel, but this is not going to be a priority, and this not remains an issue, I think.
We have a number of questions about Israel's electoral system, given the continuing deadlock. So, so people understand Israel has no constitution. It has a series of what are called basic laws that effectively serve as a quasi-constitution. So there is no such thing as constitutional amendments inside of Israel because there is no constitution. The basic law itself can be modified or amended. We actually saw that after the third election, when in order to create the office of alternate prime minister that was required for Benny Gantz and the prime ministerial rotation, the basic law on the Knesset and the government was changed. But we do have questions about the electoral system itself. What is the likelihood that the Knesset will change or modify the electoral system if a government is not formed? There's another question about going back to direct election of the prime minister, something that Israel had, I think, for 3 elections, 2 elections at the end of 1990s and early 2000s. So might we see a move to go back to direct election of the prime minister? Might we see a move to raise the Knesset threshold from its current 3.25% to get rid of some of the smaller parties? For either of you, do you think there's going to be some sort of effort to change things to break the deadlock, or are we fated to stick with this system until until it works?
I believe that the Israeli political system is working. Okay, the problem is with Netanyahu. If there is no Netanyahu anymore, I believe the system will work. It has been working for a long time. There is a problem with the number of parties, 13 parties, and with only 2 parties with 10 seats and above 10 seats, it's really a problem. So maybe increasing the threshold, it can be changed really. It can be considered. However, I believe that the instability in Israeli regime right now, it's because of Netanyahu and his status, his position, as his trial, not because of the system itself. The system itself is really working. However, we're really concerned about something else. We are the Arab citizens of State Israel. We're concerned about the expansion of the Jewishness of the state on the expense of its democratic values. And we would like to strengthen the democratic values within Israel. The issue of equality, we're really concerned with the nation-state law. Still, Israel without equality law, Israel cannot really claim democracy without having equality law. And so hopefully this coming Knesset, with the help and the support of the Arab parties, will stress for equality law, for expanding the democratic values. It's good for all. It's win-win situation for the Arab minority. It's for the Jewish majority too. So I'm not concerned about, again, the system is working, it should work, okay? Not working now because of Netanyahu, as Netanyahu's trial and what's going on with him.
Yeah, I agree with Thabet. I think that when Netanyahu leaves the scene, and eventually, I mean, he's mortal after all, everyone leaves at some point. the system will self-correct. Just for example, there's no reason for Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett and even a Victor Lieberman not to be part of Likud. You wouldn't have this fraction. They would all be Likud. I mean, maybe you'll have one right, you know, the extreme right, this new group, religious Zionism. So the system will self-correct. There are a lot of talks now about raising the thresholds again, and maybe they will go for it. As I said before, I'm not sure it will fix it. But there are talks about it. There's also talk about the direct election of the prime minister. Sorry, Michael, you were right. It's three. They had it 3 times. No, I did 3, but you only did most of it. Yeah.
I thought it was 3.
But it happened 3 times, but it wasn't seen like a good experience in Israel. And it actually undermined the power of the prime minister even more in a very weird way. So I'm not sure. I'm sure they're going to see. I'm sure we're going to see attempts, but I don't know that they're going to be so successful at changing the situation and solving.
Got it. Thabet, there's a question here for you about the American Jewish community, and you know, how can American Jewish communities better understand the importance of Arab-Israeli representation in the government, and how can American Jewish communities better understand the willingness of Arab Israelis to work with their Jewish Israeli counterparts? You know, what suggestions do you have for American Jews who want to understand this better?
Well, I'm happy that you are asking this question. Actually, we have some connections with the Jewish community. I think this webinar is so important to have Arab representatives to talk with you directly. I suggest to you, when you are coming to Israel, visit us, visit the Arab community, meet the leaders of the Arab community. Abraham Initiatives, my organization is working hard in this issue, is willing to facilitate such meetings with the political leadership, with the NGO leadership. You can learn about us directly from us, or maybe you can learn from the social media. And but what I'm saying that maybe you can invite us, invite Arab leaders to come and visit United States, talk with the Jewish community. What I can guarantee you that the Arab political leadership, the Arab leadership really interested to strengthen relationship with you, with the Jewish community in the United States, and just to try to expose all of our the challenges that we are facing. And this moment and this occasion, I would like to highly value the work of Liron, the task force in Arab affairs, trying to expose the Jewish community and to learn more about us. We are part of the state of Israel and will continue to be part of Israel state. We are a minority here. We would like, we are striving for equality, but also for integration. Again, we are knocking in the door of the government, of the Jewish parties. We are part of the system. We highly value and we see our integration in the hospitals, especially in the last year with working together, shoulder to shoulder, fighting the COVID-19. We can do it in the universities. We can work together in the factories, to be together in every single place. But we have to guarantee real equality and democracy for all. And to try just to mention, to go back and mention, yes, there is more legitimization for the Arab votes and the Arab citizen within Israel, but unfortunately also there's the right wing, and Netanyahu himself did legitimize the racist, radical, even I would say right wing radical party of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and it's very dangerous to bring people that really just are coming with hatred speeches against Arabs. It's not gonna help. I am sure that Mansour Abbas will not sit in the same government with this kind of people that really continue with the hatred speeches.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Thabet, I agree with you so much. And, you know, it's a longer conversation about equality and the need. But if there's one silver lining, right, you have Ben Gvir and Atmos on one side, but the fact that Netanyahu visited, and we know it's cynical, we know it's instrumental, but Netanyahu visited Arab towns 7 times in the last few months. It's a failure of the left camp. They didn't bring in the Arabs, but maybe there's a silver lining, right? After this year, when the medical teams are really, there's a higher representation of Israeli Arabs in medical teams. And I just read, you know, in the Technion, which is the Israeli MIT, the highest numbers of female students are Arabs. So there are great things happening, things of integration, notwithstanding the nation state bill and what happened. So at the end of the day, I think the trends are positive. Unfortunately, we have to deal with politicians. But I'll end with that.
That's a good.
I agree with you, Shira. I agree with you.
That's a good optimistic note on which to close. Yeah, I know we have lots of questions we weren't able to get to, and I could easily do this for another hour, but we have to be respectful of everyone's time. So I will turn things back over to Karen to close us out.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to Shira and Thabet and you, Michael, for an amazing and informative afternoon. As you hear, we could have gone on for hours and days on this topic, and hopefully we will continue this conversation. If you found this informative, we hope you'll consider joining JCPA in the future for their webinars and consider future programming. You can go onto their website, and in particular, they are having their first virtual annual conference on April 25th and 26th with many, many different topics, which I think you will really, really enjoy. So again, thank you to our wonderful speakers. Thank you to our participants, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. And stay healthy and well.